Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the News Behind the News with Ralph Kintav on Mix 94.7 FM. Hope that you guys have been having a blessed day so far. This afternoon, I have here with me another young professional in St. Martin, and that is Mr. Patrice Gumbs. He is the interim director of the Department of Foreign Relations. And thank you so much for coming on the program.
Yeah, Ralph, thank you for having me, and a pleasure to be here with you this morning.
Yeah, it's indeed a pleasure. You may have seen as we talked off air, I really like to keep a diversity in the people that I bring on the program, because there's so much information that we can share with the public. And I love politics, and one of the areas particularly I really do find interesting is international relations. The ways in which countries work together and so forth. And we already have a very dynamic setup with our autonomous status, our relation to the northern side of the island, and so much more, and the diversity within St. Martin itself, which is, I think, a great case study. So I would like to basically talk about that, as well as the department that you're head of, because it plays a very important role in the function of St. Martin, let's say. But before we get into all of that, I'm curious that you could share a little bit about yourself and why did you particularly go into that field?
Yeah, well, actually, I've always, just like you've been always interested in politics. I went to St. Dominic High School, primary school, when I was living here in St. Martin. I was always actively involved in student government and committees. And then I always had an interest in geopolitics. It was always just sort of game theory and how things go and how countries use influence to push certain agendas. So that was the start of it. When I went to boarding school for 2 years after St. Dominic, I took peace and conflict as a study, as one of my classes, where you basically look at different case studies of peace and conflict around the world: Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, the UK, just examples, and really got into that idea of foreign affairs is kind of my thing. It's really what I'm interested in. I did my studies actually undergrad in Paris, so I studied international and comparative politics. Did some time in South Africa as well.
Nice.
And then during that time sort of worked a lot on preparing myself for that. And the opportunities came up at our school where we got to work a lot and meet a lot of diplomats, and a lot of embassies would come to the school. We could do internships there. I did a lot of translation services for certain companies. And you really get that feel of what it means to be involved in this sort of area. But it's always been a passion of mine, politics, international relations. Did my master's sort of in global development, linking that towards how different countries with resources, XYZ, what happens to them, things like, rentier states and resource curses. Those things are my interests. And that's sort of, I can't really pinpoint when exactly it happened, but I've always just had a passion for things like diplomacy and I don't know, but it just really strengthened as time went on. And then I always thought to myself, okay, St. Martin, growing up here, we never had foreign affairs because we weren't independent, one, but also two, everything was in Curacao.
Correct.
When I was going to school. And then when I sort of, in my bachelor's, we became a country, and you didn't really hear that we had a foreign office now because of, the deconstruction in Antilles. And then when I came home one Christmas, actually, I was approached and someone said to me, "Oh, you're back home. You should be an advisor." And I was like, "Okay, in what?" They were like, "Yeah, we there's a foreign affairs office." And I was like, "Oh, okay, interesting." And it's interesting how it works here, simply because not being independent, the kingdom is still sort of responsible for foreign affairs. So it's not something that was ever really on my radar to come back home right away, given what I wanted to do and study, what I was studying, what I wanted to do in terms of my career. So when that opportunity came up, I was like, okay. And then I sort of applied, and the rest is history. I got the first job as senior policy advisor. This is 2013, 2014. And more recently, I became the interim director of the office since August 2020.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's been a very interesting career in that area, because you have to really, because you're not independent.
Yeah.
It's very much a very interesting dance you have to do, working and collaborating with the Netherlands and the St. Martin government.
Yeah, I like that you say interesting dance.
Yeah.
Because I really like to get into that. But some things that came to mind, and then especially having studied in Paris, do you speak more than 2 languages?
Yeah, so I mean, English is definitely my language, followed by French. My dad's from the French side. We never really spoke French at home, but with my grandparents, you sort of passively would hear some words. And then living in Paris, you kind of have to speak French because, there's really very little options.
The French
outside of,
they love their culture.
Yeah, they love their culture. They're very proud of their language.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I just took French in school here, and then continued taking it up until university, and then also Dutch I speak as well. You kind of have to speak Dutch. You grew up here. It's a requirement. It's definitely not as strong as you would expect, simply because there's no outlet to practice it here, and I think how it's taught here is also very
could be
limiting.
modified, yeah.
But in this field, you do really encounter a lot of things. So, for example, I just took a Spanish class to sort of reinforce my Spanish, because living in the Caribbean, that's the dominant language that you meet when you work with your neighbors.
Yeah, indeed.
Spanish.
Yeah, Latin America have a very strong influence in it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we're lucky growing up in St. Martin that we passively learn a lot of languages from any possible, just turning on the TV, from just walking on the street.
Well, if you have a friend who comes from a foreign background, and then unfortunately, the first thing you're learning a language, you learn the bad words. But then,
of course, you do.
Then you learn the other words that can kind of help you get around,
No, definitely. I think, you learn a lot here, but also too, going away. I always went to international school, for boarding school, for university as well. So, for example, the first thing you learn is Finnish bad words, which is, you don't really use, but it's sort of, I've been lucky enough to be in an environment where there's people who can teach me things and open my world and new experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely helped working in this field, particularly in St. Martin.
Okay. Yeah. So one thing that also comes to mind is, having listened to you talk about the various experiences you had, whether with your internship and even study, there definitely is some key skills that you that are necessary throughout. Whether it's through being able to interpret, analyze, and especially research and writing.
Yeah.
So how was that like for you? In really strengthening those skills, and what are the essentials? For you to be successful in what you do.
Well, I think one thing you have to do is be a people's person. I mean, this, it's not every day I wake up and had a great night or a great morning. One thing I think you have to do is learn how to sort of, and in this aspect, sort of cubbyhole or pigeonhole your different emotions. It's really emotional intelligence. Knowing, for example, that's one. Knowing, being social, 2. And then 3, of course, being objective. Because what you see often working in the Foreign Office is that a lot of things are people's opinions. You see it a lot on social media. People say things as if they're facts and they're just opinions. You get a lot of political influences in foreign affairs because it's very high-level politics. And you try to navigate how to take the best out of certain things and make it more a cohesive plan that's not about you. And I think that's something that was a challenge in the beginning, because I am very opinionated, and I think I don't necessarily mind confrontation. So sort of taking that step back and you growing over time to realize, you have to pick what you engage in. You really have to pick how to communicate in a way that everyone can understand.
Gotcha.
So interpersonal skills were very important. And of course, cohesive writing and being concise, because I tend to be very good at creative writing.
Yeah.
And that's very elaborate and fluffy, and sometimes I do speak that way as well. And you really have to get to the point.
Yeah.
Very concisely, And so those are things you have to just sort of, that I've had to work on, but are also really good skills, research and like analytical skills, seeing that, okay, if the price of something in China is going up, or some issue that's happening in the Netherlands or wherever it's happening, how is it going? How could this potentially affect St. Martin? And do you have to tell it to your minister, your SG today or tomorrow? And having that foresight to see, like, understanding how sort of economics internationally works. Like, if something happens in, for example, the Suez Canal, it was blocked, and everyone's like, oh, okay, we had to already see months in advance, this is a problem for us. When COVID happened, generally speaking, most of the island, the general bulk of government was like, oh, it's a Chinese or a Asian problem. We were like, no, a year in advance, we were like, what is going to be the response? And, you know, the response, we sort of get to the point where we become a bit slightly high-strung, maybe, as people working in foreign office, but because you really have to have vision to see how things work in the long term.
Yeah.
And
Sharp insight.
that's definitely, that's definitely a couple of the skills you kind of need to be in this field.
So another thing that comes to mind, and this is really along the lines of that interpersonal connection that you build with others. How do you not lose yourself? And I mean that as far as, you know, you do have to sometimes amend based on the culture you're working with, but you don't want to give up so much of
yourself
who you are
and be fake or chameleon.
Exactly.
I mean, I think, you know, I don't know necessarily if it's a gift, but I think oftentimes you do find yourself putting on different characters, and not that you're becoming, like you said, a whole different person, but you really have to know how to read a room and know that this approach won't work necessarily for everybody. I had to learn that over time. I had an excellent department head before me, Kalila Peters, who observed right away that I was very much a person who comes in and sort of slightly takes over a room. Sometimes you have to sort of step back and read a room first and see what works. And sometimes adjust your language, adjust your tone, adjust how you approach the situation, because you're not necessarily losing yourself, but to achieve your objective, you have to understand the person you're meeting. What are their tics? What are their motives? And it's a lot of researching on subjects that we deal with way ahead of engaging with them, so that we're not necessarily losing ourselves, but we just use different strategies on how to approach different people. I think in this field, though, sometimes what you do see, there's a classic sort of foreign affairs diplomatic persona. That's a perception that everyone's, you know, elitist, or they speak 5 languages, or they're just sort of a carbon copy of, you know, certain type. That's becoming less and less. Because I think too, working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, they're also realizing the value of difference. They're realizing that, you know, not everyone is going to be interested in fine art. Someone's going to be interested in tech or technology, and those things are actually interesting if you're trying to achieve e-diplomacy, for example. So you don't necessarily lose yourself, but you do have to wear several caps oftentimes, particularly in a small island like St. Martin where it's limited staff. You do have to have different personas sometimes to achieve
Okay,
goals.
so you're saying,
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All attached to your core.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think if you have you can't really change your personality. I mean, people, I think, at least for me, it's very hard to be fake or different than what the core Patrice is, but everyone gets a different element or different flavor of that same ice cream, for example. I don't know,
I got you. So another thing that you mentioned that I know is definitely important for any leader, really, is the way you consume news, and how do you use that in your work?
Yeah.
Especially the part of filtering.
Yeah.
The media landscape has really changed the last couple of years too. So
we have a pretty small office. right now we've sort of had quite a number of personnel shifts and changes. So we're pretty much down to an office of about 4 or 5. At its peak, we had about 8. There's space for 12, but we work pretty well with 8. So you do have to filter out because 1 or 2 persons can't consume that amount of information that comes into us daily. There are certain things that that are interesting on a global level, but for St. Martin, it's just way too abstract to bring in. So oftentimes we would just say not important. You really have to prioritize and learn. Okay, people have goals and ambitions for what they want, particularly at the political level. But you have to sort of set up boundaries and advise, okay, this sounds interesting. We can go to this conference, but we don't have the manpower or the research or the resources. So, for example, if you want to go to, I don't know, let's name one big conference, but it requires research and follow-up. Sometimes it's best to stay home and not show up, because if you show up and then you have to continue following up and engaging and you have zero content, it's even worse than not.
Yeah,
being
makes
there.
sense. That definitely, yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we've experienced a lot with, in the last couple of years in particular, St. Martin has become more and more engaged internationally, from everything from the World Bank to UNOPS to CARICOM. And 10 years now into country, we kind of have to assess what is really our priority and sort of build the Foreign Office to match our ambitions.
Yeah.
So what we have to do right now, we basically filter out what is not top priority. We use a lot of different sources. Working with Ministry of Foreign Affairs is very helpful because they have sometimes departments which are the size of our whole ministry.
Yeah, yeah.
And they do a lot of filtering out for us of things which are sometimes way out of our sort of scope of manageability.
Yeah,
in
understood.
general. Yeah.
Okay. And so, you mentioned earlier as well. So, one, you guys fall under General Affairs. So what is your relation like with the Office of the Prime Minister? What exactly do you have to report, and how do you assist in?
Yeah, so how it works basically is that Foreign Affairs is a competency of the kingdom along with defense. Well, in the most black and white terms.
Yeah.
So Foreign Affairs, defense. It was agreed when we became country that, actually it was agreed before, but when we became country 10-10, the countries could engage in foreign affairs issues related to their sort of competencies. So we call it foreign relations. So what happens basically is that the kingdom together every year, we have something called a Kingdom Foreign Affairs consultation, which sits down and basically looks at what are the interests of all the countries, and then it feeds back into the general kingdom foreign policy. In practice, what happens is that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands is also of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the whole entire kingdom, and then the Prime Minister, on his behalf, takes on foreign relations on behalf of St. Martin. So we fall under the Prime Minister's office. But the duality is that we fall under her in this case, but we have to basically, on a daily basis, we work very much with the ministry in The Hague. So there's a section in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in The Hague called Direction Western Hemisphere, which uses everything from the US, Canada, Latin America. And within that sort of department, there's a small department called Kingdom Relations. And that's who we report to, and they feed everything out within the ministries to us and all the relevant other ministries in the Netherlands in terms of information we need.
And your department is funded by St. Martin?
Yeah, by St. Martin government.
Okay.
But it's just because if we go away, for example, for UN, for World Trade Organization, any big multilateral event, it's coordinated at the kingdom level.
Understood.
So basically, when we go to New York for UNGAS every year, that's a kingdom instruction, and it's led by the king, and all 4 prime ministers attend with delegations, but it's always a unified kingdom approach to what's discussed. And what happens basically is that all the countries give input to the kingdom instruction. It's not sort of unilaterally just the Netherlands saying this is what we're going to say. We try as much as possible to make it very inclusive. At times, the messages are a bit more out of our scope, but generally speaking, everything has to be approved and commented on by all the foreign relations offices before it goes to become the kingdom instruction.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, what was it like as well in building the department? This after attaining a new status.
Yeah.
Forming relations with other international government organizations
yeah.
and so forth.
Yeah.
What had to be done?
Yeah. So I came in about 3 years after 10, well, 4 years, so to speak. And at that time, I think how it worked, from what I understood, was that basically there was a consultant hired to create the department which didn't exist in St. Martin. So you have, for example, justice didn't exist in St. Martin. You had foreign affairs is one, another that didn't exist. A couple of others didn't exist. And I think the premise was, in the beginning, was that, St. Martin is smaller, so we're going to need less staff. It doesn't work that way because your international obligations don't change because of your size. So when I first came into the BBA, as it's called, Foreign Office, there was a spot for 3 policy people, of which one is a treaty lawyer and 2 other policy people, but then there were 6 protocol officers. So the understanding of foreign affairs already wasn't there because they thought it was just, foreign affairs is the protocol services that takes the ministers to the airport and organizes cocktail parties and
It's
flights
far
all
more
the
than
time.
that. Yeah.
So that has shifted a lot to focus more and more on the content as time has gone on. We did a lot of reshuffling, a lot of changing, and right now I'm actually trying to reshuffle again because a lot of, in the beginning, was trying to basically take over what we needed to from the Netherlands Antilles. So all the treaties that we were party to, all the organizations that the Netherlands was party to, we had to just basically copy-paste them into St. Martin legislation. So a lot of the beginning years was a lot of that, joining things for the sake of joining them, taking over treaties because we had to. So right now what we've seen is that, we've taken over much of the things, we now have to engage on a more substantive level. What that means now is that you need to actually have more policy people. You actually have to, match your ambitions with your staff, your budgets. It's not very cheap to have a foreign office because it's sometimes years of going back and forth, traveling, negotiation. Sometimes it's seen as very fluffy because the results are not immediate. And it's very hard sometimes in a country which has a lot of more pressing issues to justify why you see the prime minister or a whole delegation traveling. But, really and truly, if we want to think of things more long term, that's what we have to do, is change the concept and as to what is foreign affairs and why is this happening. We're not going on a trip because it's a vacation, it's a lot of work. And I think what we're doing a lot of that before and still today is sort of educating people and even the government as a whole sometimes on this isn't just a department of fun and there's a lot of work that goes into it.
Fun and trips, basically. Yeah.
And I think what's happening now is that we've joined a lot of organizations.
And do we pay membership fees?
Yes, we pay membership fees for quite a few of them, for most of them actually. But then, what you do get is a lot in return in terms of technical assistance. We do get a lot of, where possible, because the St. Martin's not independent, a lot of countries don't give us aid. Because we're not independent, we're seen as part of the kingdom, so why would...
So the kingdom stats would kind of cover us.
Yeah. So it'd be essentially, why is Germany giving the Kingdom of the Netherlands money, or why is the US giving the Kingdom of the Netherlands? So, it's sort of, we're not seen as an individual global country. So oftentimes you hear people say that, we're a state, we're not a state. The state is the kingdom.
Yeah.
We're a country within a state, or an entity within a state. So it's very complicated. So it's very hard sometimes. People ask, what are you getting for becoming a member? I'm just like, well, it's a building block. Because at some point, you're going to want to become more and more self-reliant, you need to have people who know who you are, people who basically can vouch for you. It's, a lot of what foreign affairs basically is, in a nutshell, is reputation management. I tell people all the time, I was like, I should have taken a marketing class, because a lot of what we do is clean up work for government. So, and it's a lot of going to international hearing meetings on things like human rights issues and social issues, and it's just basically trying to constantly make sure that St. Martin is kept up with what's internationally acceptable and respectable.
We cannot function in a silo.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And we see it just the makeup of the island alone says that.
Because I think too, one of the sort of prime examples of that concept of siloism that we have sometimes is that, I know when the World Bank first came, sort of in the recovery phases, a lot of the discussion you saw from the ground up, from like Facebook posts to even Parliament, people saying, they're coming here and you're not going to pay tax. I'm like, well, this is across the board. International organizations, staff never pay tax when they go to a country, because it's understood that they're paying taxes at their home country. When we have ambassadors and diplomats come, we don't necessarily take care of them because they're special people, but because they represent the state and they have documents which are sensitive, you can't go into their bags. And I tell you about the time, if we had St. Martiners abroad in foreign countries, they also would receive those same exact privileges and immunities. Mm-hmm. But I think it's this sort of like trying to really, like I mentioned before, we have a lot of work to do still on changing the perception of what foreign affairs is, why we're here and why we do what we basically do. But also too, in terms of that, international organizations, we've joined quite a few, Association of Caribbean States. There's a lot of talk about joining CARICOM. We've been working with CARICOM for a number of years in sort of negotiating, becoming an associate member.
Was there any approach to OECS?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, we approached them, the Secretary General, on joining OECS. And then there was a plan for a visit to the headquarters in 2017, and we had Hurricane Irma. It's sort of come back on the agenda now, because I think what we're trying to focus on, having seen that post-Hurricane Irma, there's so many organizations who want to come to St. Martin, structuring basically, again, and reviewing who we're actually engaging with. Because with a small country, you can't engage with everybody. So you have to really prioritize and see what we're doing. One of our plans for next year is to re-engage with OECS. Because as St. Martin is a country which we have a lot in terms of multiculturalism, and we're very, very cosmopolitan in terms of the people we have lived, but we really are still relatively closed off to how the global world works. And a lot of persons are interested in us, but we have to know what we want to do with them. Because my biggest fear is that we join organizations not just to be on the table, and we don't have much content.
Like it has to lead towards our national vision. Let's say,
exactly.
We have that we actually see, our aspirations be achieved, and not cosmetic sort of
exactly.
approach. Yeah,
and I think one of the things we also do is sort of coordinate all ministries' actions as much as possible, because people might not know, but if, for example, the dump is an issue, for example, or coral reef maintenance is an issue, there's international treaties which actually we may be in violation of because of things we do here on a very micro level. Mm-hmm. So if there's a treaty about, for example, the right to clean air, the right to a good life or good house or whatever, and that's not addressed at the most micro policy level, somebody can bring this to attention of the committees of the treaties, and you can be called out. So a lot of what it is...
But then in that, the person responsible will be like the Netherlands, for example, right?
So, and this is one of the awkward things, because there are a couple of cases where St. Martin has violated some treaties.
With a prison, for example?
Particularly the human rights treaties, yes. And it's the signatory of the treaty is the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but the responsibility is that of the autonomous country. So the kingdom basically would get the verdict or the bill, if it's a bill involved.
Yeah.
And then it has to be forwarded down to St. Martin. And it's not that the kingdom is necessarily at fault, it's just because in international law, there is no St. Martin. We don't exist in terms of as a subject, so to speak. So everything comes to the state, which is the kingdom, and then within the state, it's sort of figure out, okay, who has to do what. And that's why, in the last couple of years, we've had a number of issues like that, where we've seen more and more that across the government board, they're realizing more and more that you have to pay attention to these international aspects of your work.
Definitely.
In the Netherlands, for example, every ministry has an international division. That's not necessarily possible right now in St. Martin. So as they be in this small little office, we have a lot of coordinating to do with very limited resources. So it's definitely a challenge, but it's always fun. I must say that it's sometimes you go in, like you said earlier, once you go to work and you love what you're doing, it's never really a chore. You always have fun doing it.
Yeah, that's true.
When it comes to the international engagements, that's always fun, but it's always again, going back to that, we have to know what we want. Because I know a lot of people talk about, St. Martin trades. We don't actually trade. Because, government, first of all, we don't necessarily, when we import something here, the containers kind of go back empty. Mm-hmm. There's not much that goes in our containers back out in terms of production from St. Martin.
Correct.
Secondly, trading means also that government has an insight into what is coming and going and has control as to, for example, preferential treatment and tariffs. We don't do any of that. It's really a free market. It's supply and demand.
Open system.
Yeah. So then, a lot of times people are like, why aren't we doing this? I'm just like, because we're going to join an organization that isn't really relevant. Globally, it's relevant, but why would you want to pay so much money to just be at a table and then just be there? Within our whole foreign affairs network of embassies and missions and information, whatever you want to know, you can know. If I had information, for example, one time someone wanted to know how they can export lobsters from St. Martin and Saba to China. I didn't have to fly to China or, go research. You just call your embassy in China and they tell you, well, here's the requirements, EU, non-EU related, because our relationship is very different than other Caribbean countries with the EU. And, we can't necessarily engage with certain countries as freely. And then, of course, when it comes to trade, you have to think, for example, what percentage is made in the country. So it's a whole lot that goes into what seems like just putting some lobsters in a bag and setting it on a plane.
Yeah,
it's a lot of information. So it really requires across the board understanding by all ministries.
So in order for someone to contact any other country, does it have to be through the Dutch embassy?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
So certain countries are very ticklish, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it involves high-level politics and high-level repercussions for contacting them. In other countries, it's not necessarily, they're more friendly relations there, or they're more personal. So, for example, any Caribbean country, we generally can contact on our own, because it's a much more personal relationship than it is a high politics relationship. Other countries, if you want to engage with them, we usually go to the embassy. Yeah. So you're thinking of your China, your
any chance
your US. We haven't really done much with Russia, but that would definitely be a country that we would have to go through the embassy, where we would either contact our embassy in Moscow, or we would contact the Russian embassy in The Hague. So it can go several different ways. But I mean, always when we go abroad, we meet people and you get maybe the Russian ambassador's card or whatever, you can contact him. But when it gets to a point where it's like a negotiation or some kind of thing being made, it's ideal to go through the kingdom because one, the capacity isn't there necessarily
You have to consider
engage.
geopolitics.
Yeah, but also the geopolitics of speaking to countries which have global influence and power.
Yeah.
Yeah, because sometimes we casually say things and it's read as, okay, the kingdom thinks this. So you have to be very, very careful.
Tread lightly.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
Something that comes to mind, though, listening to you is the sort of quagmire that we're in, where, falling under the Netherlands means we do have a level of autonomy and so forth, but it means that like we have this, whether a cap or a shade, that we can't escape to that. Let's say whether get a grant or certain supports from whether it's the U.S., Latin America, and so forth. So then, because then as a result, your first line of contact is the Netherlands because they are the ones, quote unquote, responsible for you. But then that now comes into the whole relation.
It's
we have the kingdom that is
it's kind of like what I said. This sort of
trained.
dance you have to do because when it comes to things with financing, we always ask why can't we take money from other people, but when St. Martin takes money from other people, it's not St. Martin. And it's not necessarily how the kingdom is structured, it's just how the world is. There needs to be a state which is basically responsible for whatever debt is incurred financially. So if we fail to pay a bill internationally, it's not St. Martin who's going to have to pay. If we can't pay a loan, at the end of the day, the Netherlands is the one who actually eventually would have to foot the bill. So that's why, not to get too political, but I think that's why sometimes people question a lot of the role of the CFT and the role of the Netherlands. But, if I, in the end of the day, have to pay whatever debts you incur in the long run.
Basically, you protect your money.
You got to protect your money. And I think in my experience working in the Foreign Office, we've met several people who were interested in helping St. Martin post-Irma, and the interest rates were not comparable to what you were getting from the Dutch at the time.
Sorry to cut you off there. A question I have for you there is, what about the other side as far as what you have to give? So for example, let's say in the building of the airport, let's say we decided we wouldn't have gone with the Netherlands and support, we would have gone with an independent organization or financial company, whatever. While considering that interest rates would not be the same, in a case like that, have you realized that there was usually more requirements or let's say conditions that would be placed as well? Because I guess that's where you kind of get the clashing.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think when it comes to the details of sort of the lending details, we don't necessarily get involved in it. But again, I think what it boils down to is you do have to give up a lot more, because when you have this relationship with the kingdom, it's always going to be contentious simply because it's not necessarily a financial lender, more as a political guarantor. A private company will lend you money and they don't care about anything but their private return. When money is lent to you by someone who is politically more powerful than you and controls a lot of what can happen within your country, and they have vested interest to make sure that they get back their money, and they can get back their money in different ways, they do use it. And it's clear. And I think a lot of what the Netherlands is doing is basically ensuring that eventually they don't have to keep on paying for St. Martin in the long term. But it's also geopolitical. I mean, St. Martin is very interesting as an economic place. I mean, anywhere where there's a lot of investment and opportunity, you're going to find people, and I think the Netherlands is no different. I mean, the Netherlands' foreign policy is based strictly on trade. I mean, historically speaking, they've never really been a settler community. It's always been create a post and let's focus on commerce. I tell people all the time too that, if you look at the all the money we're getting for the trust fund, that's basically Dutch taxpayers' money, and they have to find some way to get that money back, because it's a very politically sensitive thing to give 500 something million to any country, even if it's within the same state. And it's trying to find a way to make it more palpable to your people that you're giving this money.
The investment is secure.
Yeah. So then basically it's just the methods being used is basically methods to ensure that they get a return on their investment. So they're going to put this here, they're going to put a person here and pay them out of the same money, and it goes back anyway to Dutch taxation. So it's really just looking at, it's actually the fact that because they're a donor who also has the ability to affect government and politics, that's why it's so contentious. Because there's also donors as well who can do this, but they have to through the back door. I mean, when a private bank or a donor comes to you as well, they also influence what happens politically in the
and there's
country.
certain stakes they prefer.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is that the Netherlands has the power to, by pen, just control a lot of what happens politically, socially on your island.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's the same result, but achieved indirectly versus directly, versus if you have the Netherlands versus a private person who would have influence. I mean, we see it here all the time with politics too. I mean, there are persons who give and give and give to certain people, and they get what they want from government. Yeah. This is just a much more macro level.
So it's like, it's two things that come to mind listening to you and to simplify it, it's sort of a chess game, but also, choosy this day who you will serve.
I mean,
because you have different options, but the outcome is not necessarily different.
No, it's the same exact outcome. I mean, and not looking at just, and I think you brought up a point which is very good. You could pay much less with one person, but what are you giving up? You don't necessarily want to give up to the point that you've lost yourself.
Yes.
And I think that's where the role of strong negotiation, the role of understanding the motives behind why are the conditions what they are.
Yeah. And then I think this is important for voters, for St. Martin, excluding Netherlands, to really push accountability and good governance.
Yeah.
Because it will limit the conditions and so forth that you have, that you get.
Because I will tell you, not to divulge too much, but a lot of the conditions that we have, and I think the Prime Minister said this before, a lot of the things that are conditions now are stuff we're working on, but a lot of these conditions are also stuff that, as the Foreign Office, we've sort of highlighted over the years, you have to fix this, you should think about this. And, for different reasons, either be they financial or more just not seeing it, they weren't able to be addressed.
So how has, our tumultuous history affected our look, internationally? Like for example, when you mentioned marketing and sort of kind of cleaning up where the Foreign Office is concerned, has that really, so has the instability St. Martin experience really dealt a blow to us?
Yeah, definitely. The political instability really does affect foreign affairs. Some countries you can do deals and make things happen pretty quickly. Those are very few countries. The vast majority of countries rely on a personal relationship. So it's, for example, going to a country once, they come to you, having meetings, and you go back, and they come back. And in that, they also look at how committed you are and how stable you are. We've had, when I first started at the Foreign Office, we had the first Prime Minister, Sarah Westcott, was still Prime Minister in her last year. Then we had an election. We sort of went through, I think it's been 8 years I've been working in the office now. I should have technically only seen 2 Prime Ministers. I've seen officially 5 and then interim 2 or 3 more. So it's been 8 Prime Ministers for the 8 years I've there. It's very hard for a country to look at you seriously for investment if they see a different face and a different, and less so face, but a different policy every year. There was a country we were working on very intensely. It was one of the countries who really needed that sort of consistent and sort of pampering. Government fell, and the next government that came in didn't have any interest in that country. And that's why, as the Foreign Office, we try and stick to sort of set plan of priority countries who we really engage with all the time, because you can't sort of engage with countries at a whim. I think that's where we kind of have to find that balancing act locally with our leaders when they get elected as a Foreign Office, is that everyone comes with ambitions and dreams, which is fine. It's actually very sometimes refreshing when ministers come in and they have interests that they want to peruse and sort of go forward with. But you have to sort of advise, okay, I need to see what the long-term plan is for this, because I can't engage with someone knowing in the back of my mind what has happened in the past.
And then drop the ball, because I also get that would affect, for the office, your individual, reputation to an extent.
I mean, I think people who work in diplomacy, they kind of do see that it's not necessarily you. It's more the country.
Yeah.
But it becomes, when you go back to them with a new government, a new minister or a new delegation, they're kind of like, oh.
Yeah.
And we've seen that a lot in more recent times, to the point where we sort of said, okay, you know what, we're not going to engage as much anymore. And we sort of really stripped back our work plan and our priorities from our office. And when ministers come in, we do sort of indicate that it's not a good idea, or let's hold off, or we'll keep it technical for now. Let's reach out to somebody who's on a technical level and start discussions, not necessarily go and fly there and meet a prime minister or a president or whoever. But no, stability really does affect foreign affairs, because it's just, what we've seen is that every government generally tends to have a different foreign affairs agenda. Mm-hmm. It doesn't change much on a more day-to-day basis, but when it comes to foreign affairs, I think people find it very interesting because of what you can do. So they tend to put a lot of emphasis on their personal ambitions with foreign affairs. Mm-hmm. So I mean, you have a country, if for example iPhone is a country, one minister wants to do everything iPhone, and then he leaves, and everyone's like, well, no, we're now doing Samsungs. Yeah. And the relationship with iPhone is important because iPhone is a global power. Yeah. And you're like, this isn't normal. Yeah. You know what I mean? So
it's like again, simplifying it, but it's like, when you're in school, mm-hmm. Everyone needs a couple amount of friends. You need somebody that you can count on, you get support of. Yeah. So when you shaft everyone, it's like people kind of like, when you come around, mm-hmm. No one wants you to sit next to them. Yeah. That's it.
And I think it's one of the things that we saw too when the whole decolonization sort of narrative came up. The wish was for us to go out and find people to sort of talk to about our issue.
Were you guys involved with the Troharris thing with Parliament? Were you guys contacted for that?
So what happened, that was pretty much an initiative independent of the Foreign Office. Okay. And when the report was then submitted to the United Nations, all of a sudden it lands on my desk because it's actually a foreign affairs issue completely. Because if you send something as to the United Nations Committee for Decolonization, it's understood that the whole country knows what's going on with this particular initiative.
That was basically in the shadows.
So it lands on our desk. We get questions asked, and you don't necessarily have much insight into where this came from. So again, this is one of the things again as to how you have to streamline things through the Foreign Affairs Office.
So with Parliament again, so for example, with or membership of Parlatino. Are you guys involved in that, or is that?
No, that's completely because when it comes to foreign affairs, we really work on behalf of the government.
Okay.
The parliament does things separately. They do ask us for advice on certain things.
Okay.
But usually they're pretty much independent of us because when it comes to we represent sort of the government, and a parliamentarian cannot go abroad and represent St. Martin. They have to go as part of a government delegation.
So okay, so
Yeah.
even as a St. Martin parliamentarian, so it still has to be.
Yeah. So basically, anywhere in the kingdom, a parliamentarian doesn't go to the U.S. and receives.
And you can't say I'm a member of the St. Martin Parliament. Can they? If they state it as if I'm representing, let's say if the president of Parliament, I'm representing the Parliament of St. Martin, does that count? Or will it still be seen as you're representing St. Martin?
It's still so. For example, anytime the Parliament wants to go and meet a foreign country, it has to be based on a mandate from the Prime Minister. They can't necessarily just go and meet the president of another country on their own. So the only international exposure of Parliament really is Parlatino.
Okay, understood.
Yeah, because it's sort of on a parliamentary level.
Okay, understood. So one of the things I would definitely like to end off with is, of course, so as I said in the beginning, St. Martin is a perfect case study, and one of the reasons for that is that we live on a foreign affairs situation with our border.
Yeah,
so what is it like doing negotiations with the French side, particularly because we understand that is really you're not necessarily working with the collectivity, but actually the French state.
Yeah.
And how is that like?
Yeah. It's interesting because a lot of people don't realize, being a St. Martin, the French side and the Dutch side are one and the same. It's not, we cross a border, but we don't really see it that way. It's culturally, socially the same people, just with a line sort of in the middle. When it comes, though, to the politics and sort of understanding everything in the relations, it's a completely different situation. We saw it when, with the outbreak of COVID, on a 37 square mile island, both sides had very different ways of everything from how they dealt with COVID, their sort of systems to address COVID, as well how they were counting COVID numbers. It's completely different. So that's one example. But what you see a lot here is that on the Dutch side, we have far more autonomy in almost all areas. Even in non-autonomous areas, we do have some space, like foreign affairs. But on the French side, it's very different. Everything is a very centralized state. Everything has to go through Paris. So the role of the governor representing the king and the prime minister is very different than the prefet and the president representing the French president or the French state, so to speak. What we do often is we do meet with the French on a technical level, but increasingly it's become more and more political. So you meet often with the prefet, with the prime minister, often with the president as well. But you do see how different the responsibilities and the competencies are. And it's interesting because we have this border which 1648 divides the island into cute story, and we have out of it sort of a border issue that's going on. And how it's handled basically is that the French look at it as a border issue, and the area in and around the border has become a situation where it's led to a lot of more high-level discussions, which are affecting St. Martin people without really understanding the culture behind the border. So in the sense that you have a lot of people in Paris or The Hague discussing a border. Sometimes they've never even been to St. Martin. So on our end, when we discussed the border, we just actually had a positive outcome where after about a year and a half of stalemate, we've restarted the border discussions again. And the idea basically is to give a modern border to what it is right now, because the Treaty of Concordia just states basically the French will remain in the north, the Dutch in the south around the salt pans.
Yeah.
There's no modern map coordinates, anything like that. So that's what we're basically busy with now.
And that would also include water rights and stuff?
Water rights. So, for example, the big Strabo Oyster Pond that everyone's very concerned about. If you look at the historical maps of St. Martin, we've done a lot of research from maps from the 1700s up until 1979. No one seems to ever want to touch Oyster Pond, tree of map making on the island of St. Martin. And what you see is that from our side, just for example of how the different systems are, on our side in the meeting between the Kingdom and the French Republic, a St. Martin delegation is present. But on the side of the French, it's really sort of centralized, handled by persons in Paris working in the ministries. So it's a very different approach when it comes to how we manage the island. When it comes to the border is discussed at the state level, so the préfet, whereas the border is discussed at the prime minister level, so local government. And we have that competency along with BZ, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in The Hague. But it's just interesting because overall what we see is that there's a very, the more we become a country, the more international we want to become, the differences between French and Dutch side are becoming more and more marked.
Highlighted,
simply because they're in the EU, we're not in the EU. They have to follow EU laws and regulations, and we don't.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people.
Funny.
Just quick. I think a lot of people like to romanticize what St. Martin was years ago, but it was never really like that. It was just that things were never really
set in place,
applied.
Yeah,
laws weren't applied.
Yeah.
It's not out of the blue that the Dutch and the French are coming now and putting in. It's just that I think now they're just applying things, because you will see more and more we're party to treaties that we are internationally obligated to, but we don't have the laws to actually put them into place. So we've existed internationally on paper, like with these laws, but don't actually implement them. I think what you see now is implementation of what we should be,
like a
if we want to
hardening
become
of the
a country
regulations
internationally. And it's, of course, it's contentious because, St. Martin is very easygoing. People here know how to innovate to survive. And where we lacked in terms of laws or whatever, we just made it work.
True.
And, as time has gone on, we've become more and more exposed to the fact that we have to do things in an internationally correct way. And that becomes oftentimes could be seen as colonial or takeover, but it's actually just, even if you were independent, you would have to do this.
Compliance.
So, it's international compliance. And I mean, there's something to be said about, the global north and their requirements for the global south. But internationally, a lot of what we are applying on both sides right now and what sort of makes tense relationship between French and Dutch are stuff that we have to really just apply even if we're independent. So it's really...
I follow you.
Yeah.
I follow you.
Yeah. So everything from customs to knowing what comes into your ports. I mean, it's a condition in the lands packet. But hey, if you want to trade, you kind of have to know what comes into your ports.
You can't just be as open. This is basically laissez-faire.
Yeah.
We have open ports. You could come in, you kind of do what you want. But
it's just unfortunate because it's come on the heels of a hurricane, pandemic, and sort of a growing nationalism on the island, which sort of looks at it from a point of view of,
Man, we could go on so much.
It's a lot of philosophical thoughts in this area of work, but it's definitely something that I love to do.
But I really appreciate it. Honestly, I really appreciate you coming here because you helped clarify a whole lot of things.
Yeah,
So,
no, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. And anytime you have any questions, feel free to contact me again.
yeah, will do. Because one of the final things that came to mind, listening to you, that it just left me. The thought just left me. But so, for example, you mentioned Oyster Pond and all of that. So I'll have you back here again because it's a lot that we can talk about.
Yeah.
So on that note, any final thing you want to share?
No, I mean, if anyone's ever interested in any questions about foreign affairs, feel free to contact me. I'm an open book. We do cover a lot of stuff. We have a pretty young, dynamic team. We're going to be growing soon. So, just be on the lookout for everything we're doing and know that we are trying our best to, bring St. Martin and keep St. Martin sort of in line and do our best where we can to support the economic development and growth of our island.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, guys. That was Patrice Gumbs from the Department of Foreign Affairs.
Yep.
Thank you so much for tuning in. And this was definitely an insightful and informative program. And be sure to tune in tomorrow for our next conversation. Take care. All righty.